One thing he said to me is, I don't trust anyone at all. No, none of these allies are really our friends. They just have their interests. And that was a shock. Maybe it shouldn't have been so shocking, but it was a shock to Zelensky.
This is Beyond the Scoop, a podcast from Harriman Magazine at Columbia University's Harriman Institute. I'm your host, Masha Udensiva-Brenner, and that was Simon Shuster.
I'm a senior correspondent for Time Magazine and the author of The Showman, a wartime biography of President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine.
Simon came to the Harriman Institute last spring to discuss his book, and we interviewed him for the latest issue of Harriman Magazine. A lot has changed, even since the magazine came out. So I went back to Simon to learn more about Zelensky, the historical context that brought us to this point, and Zelensky's sense of frustration with international relations that you heard Simon describe in the opening clip of this episode. The frustration dates back to 2019, says Simon, when Zelensky first came under the bullying tactics of President Trump.
This was a real moment of disenchantment with his own abilities to maneuver on the stage of international affairs and in the ugliness of international affairs and how demeaning it can be for a president of a country like Ukraine.
Simon's book about Zelensky is so gripping it reads like a novel, and it provides important historical context that can give us a deeper understanding of current events. So when I interviewed him over Zoom this spring, we talked about some of the history that's been largely forgotten, even though it happened fairly recently. An example of that forgotten history is the first Trump administration's sale of Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. That was back in 2017, but President Trump kept mentioning it during his tumultuous Oval Office meeting with President Zelensky in February.
I gave you javelins. I gave you the javelins to take out all those tanks. Obama gave sheets and Trump gave javelins.
Can you contextualize that for us, including some of the caveats that came with the sale?
The Javelin decision was a big deal. It is something that Obama had refused to do, and we could talk a long time about the reasons for that. The way I think about it is President Obama was quite closely aligned with then-Chancellor Angela Merkel, and she was quite a big influence on him in terms of what was the right thing to do in developing relations with Russia and addressing the war in Ukraine, which, as I think most of your readers will know, began in 2014 under Obama with the annexation of Crimea.
Germany's Angela Merkel was a key negotiator, mediating what came to be known as the Minsk Agreements. They were signed in 2014 and 2015, and they called for a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine's army was flailing at the time, and Russia had the upper hand. The resulting agreements were not favorable to Ukraine.
But Merkel and I think to a large extent Obama saw it as, well, this is the deal we have. And they were applying pressure on both the Russians and the Ukrainians to fulfill their end of that devil's bargain. In that scenario, there isn't a need to arm Ukraine because that would go against the idea of implementing this peace deal, the Minsk Accords.
And then why did the Trump administration decide to sell those weapons, and what conditions did they sell them under? Because they weren't the most favorable conditions.
That's right. The conditions were a little bit funny. As I recall, was that you have to keep these things locked up in storage in Western Ukraine, far away from the front lines, and only use them if there's a large-scale attack from the Russians. So that was the condition. Why Trump decided to do that? Trump was being accused at the time of having close ties with Russia.
At that time, Special Counsel Robert Mueller was investigating Russian interference into the 2016 election that brought Trump to power.
I think Trump wanted to show, hey, I'm not soft on Russia. Look, I'm going to do what Obama never did. I'm going to send these tank buster rockets to the Ukrainians. It didn't cost him much. I think it did serve to punch a hole in the arguments that he was somehow under Putin's thumb, and he still brings it up all the time.
Of course, Zelensky wasn't yet in office when Trump sold the weapons to Ukraine. And when he did enter office, he didn't want weapons. He wanted to make peace with Russia. But that didn't last long.
When Zelensky's efforts to negotiate a lasting peace with Putin broke down, I'd say at the end of 2020, Zelensky gradually shifted to a position where we need to achieve peace through strength. We can't do it by kowtowing or appeasing Putin. And the appointment of General Zaluzhny was part and parcel of that shift in Zelensky's thinking, that we need to get tough on the Russians.
General Valery Zaluzhny is a major character in Simon's book.
And Zaluzhny was seen as an officer who had the chops for that kind of assignment. And indeed, when he was appointed, Ukraine took a much more assertive posture in standing up to the Russians.
Zelensky appointed the general to lead Ukraine's armed forces in the summer of 2021. By that time, more than 100,000 Russian troops had massed on Ukraine's border with Russia and Belarus. But Ukraine's military was still a relic of Soviet times, a rigid, top-down command structure with little room to respond to the unpredictability of modern warfare. General Zaluzhny wanted to change this, and after stepping into his role, he found himself having to walk a tightrope between the U.S. government and President Zelensky.
November, December 2021, January 2022, the Americans begin warning very vocally that invasion is coming, you need to get prepared. And Zaluzhny, even though he didn't really believe that the invasion would be as big and horrible as the Americans predicted, he still said we need to take measures to get ready. And Zelensky's administration were pushing back. They thought that those preparations were too intense, that they would cause panic among the population.
Zelensky feared investors would flee Ukraine, and so would ordinary civilians, those eager to dodge the draft or seek safety outside the country.
Zelensky was afraid that if you have this panic, it would even make it easier for Russia to conquer Ukraine because the country would be basically hollowed out and unable to defend itself. So it's a complicated kind of back and forth, but fundamentally, Zaluzhny, the general, was calling for more robust preparations, and Zelensky, the president, was asking him to hold off.
And he was kind of doing them in secret, both from President Zelensky and the Americans.
Yes. He also was very afraid that the preparations that he was undertaking would become known to the Russians. So one thing he said was, the enemy needs to believe that we're sitting in our barracks, scrolling through Facebook and smoking weed. We want the Russians to believe that so that they feel overconfident if they do attack us, and we can surprise them with the Ukrainian defense. That is what ended up happening.
And to go back to Zelensky, there's a really telling quote in the book that contrasts your first meeting with Zelensky after he became president and then your first meeting with him during the full-scale invasion. And I just want to read it here. In the fall of 2019, I had met Zelensky in these rooms. He had described them as a fortress he wanted to escape. Only a year removed from his life as an actor, he looked so vulnerable then, so wounded, as he exposed his disgust with politics to say, "I don't trust anyone at all." Now, when he was truly vulnerable, one Russian missile strike away from death, the president carried an air of invincibility, as though the war had made him grow some stubborn armor that no weapon in the world could break. That quote in mind, I asked Simon to talk about the evolution of Zelensky in the context of his relationship with Trump.
It's a very different Zelensky that Trump is dealing with today compared to 2019. I observed and reported on that first scandal with President Trump in 2019 that led to President Trump's first impeachment. And I remember meeting with Zelensky at the time, this was November 2019, when the impeachment process was unfolding on Capitol Hill.
Trump had called Zelensky and asked him to investigate his electoral rival Joe Biden and Biden's son, who had dealings in Ukraine. Trump threatened to pull military aid to Ukraine if Zelensky failed to oblige. The affair completely disillusioned Zelensky.
It was a really hard lesson, a painful lesson in how ugly international affairs and politics can be. He wasn't expecting it. He said, I don't trust anyone at all. None of these allies are really our friends. They just have their interests. Maybe it shouldn't have been so shocking, but it was a shock to Zelensky. He was expecting that alliances were like friendships, that there was a bond between countries and their leaders and that they would have your back. But what that scandal in 2019 taught him is that no, all of this is very unreliable. All these alliances, they shift depending on the shifting winds in foreign countries, the whims of foreign leaders. And this is why he came to the conclusion that you can't really trust anybody in international affairs.
Zelensky has internalized this lesson, says Simon, and he's adapted his interactions with foreign leaders accordingly. But there's one thing that's stayed constant about him since he took office back in 2019.
He couldn't accept the fact that foreign leaders would talk down to him because they seemed to see Ukraine as some kind of second-rate country.
Simon says that drives Zelensky nuts.
And we saw that again, I certainly saw it in that blow-up on February 28th in the Oval Office, where Zelensky demanded to be spoken to with respect. And he wouldn't bow and act like a supplicant before Trump. He holds his head high, he has a strong backbone, and for better or worse, sometimes really to his own detriment, he refuses to play by these courtesies and niceties and bow and scrape as is sometimes required of politicians.
And one thing that's been really striking to me reading your book, Zelensky really follows his gut. And in the last chapter, Kherson is liberated. And against all security advice, he decides to go there and give a press conference in the central square. The Russians are just across the river, a mile away, able to shoot him down at any time. He's not wearing a bulletproof vest. He's not wearing a helmet. He has a Russian intelligence drone that he doesn't know about but can surmise looming over his head. And yet he comes and gives this speech because he wants to connect with the people. And I'd like for you to just elaborate a little bit on that and how that has evolved since you've written the book.
That's something that emerged in the first months or the first year of the full-scale invasion. He began to feel this need to demonstrate courage to the world and to his own people, to put his own neck on the line because he was asking Ukrainian soldiers to do the same thing, to fight for the country. So when reporting the book and this trip to Kherson that you just mentioned, just after it was liberated, I went with him on the train on that trip. And it's terrifying. He goes right up to where it's most dangerous, even when he is directly warned of Russian troops nearby and Russian drones overhead and so on. He ignores that to the point where, for me, it was just like, is this really necessary? Do we need to be here right now? My tolerance for risk is not nearly as high as President Zelensky's, but he sees it as fundamental, not only to leading his own nation by example and his armed forces, but also showing Western leaders, look, this is sometimes what it takes to defend democracy and independence and sovereignty. And I think that really had an important psychological effect that I try to describe in the book on foreign leaders who then, you remember in 2022 and still to a lesser extent today, visit Kyiv, go to the front line. We're talking prime ministers, ministers of defense, presidents of foreign countries.
Former President Joe Biden also visited Ukraine back in the winter of 2023, and his top general, Mike Milley, became good friends with Ukraine's top general, Volodymyr Zelensky.
The level of friendship that they developed was really moving to observe at the time and to describe in the book. Those relationships really helped Ukraine survive through the first year, the second year, and up to today. But that has not been the case, I should underline, with the Trump administration. They were actually making a point of refusing to go to the war zone because, as Vice President Vance called it, these are propaganda tours. So what we're seeing is Zelensky, so many of his allies who were behind him and with him early in the invasion have left office. Boris Johnson, Chancellor Scholz of Germany is now leaving. Democratically elected leaders, they cycle in and out, and every time Zelensky and his team need to rebuild those relationships.
And are there any threads of hope that you see in this current situation?
Yes, let's talk about the hopeful things. The hopeful thing, and this is something Zelensky said recently, is that the best guarantee of security for Ukraine ultimately is the armed forces of Ukraine. Yes, they are suffering immensely right now from the U.S. decision to pull back on various kinds of support, perhaps especially intelligence sharing, because what that does is it blinds the Ukrainian armed forces on many fronts. American intelligence sees all. Through satellites, through intercepts, it's incredibly powerful. And the way that they were sharing intel with the Ukrainians was critical to their success on the battlefield. So that hurts. But what I've also seen in the last years is how much the Ukrainians have developed their armed forces, their society, and their military industry. So if you want to talk about Ukraine's survival, that is very hopeful. They can fight. They are very well trained. They're tired, but they are very battle hardened. And I think no less important, the military industry is producing arms at an incredible rate. I visited just recently a factory where they produce combat drones, basically bombers and suicide drones. It's insane, the scale of the production. They can produce 4,000 per day. That's a massive swarm.
How many did they used to produce?
0. 2 years ago, when they started ramping up this production, they produced no drones. They were buying them from Turkey. They didn't have any. Now it's a really incredible industry. So they are able to put up a fight. They've used these drones to hold back the Russians, to make it basically impossible for the Russians to advance in any conventional way along most of the front line. I think the Trump administration underestimates the extent to which the Ukrainians certainly feel an ability to continue fighting even without American support. They see how innovative people, their engineers, their soldiers have been. So I think anyone who's ready to count Ukraine out hasn't been there and hasn't seen the level of innovation and the level of strength that the military industry and the armed forces have shown.
And another thread throughout the book is this undercurrent of the awareness that as Zelensky consolidates his power under martial law, one day the war will end and it will be a storm for him afterward. A lot of reckonings to deal with, a lot of actions that he's taken that he can be criticized for. And I'm curious how his domestic standing is currently.
Well, in the period when I was there, end of February and into March, his approval ratings have been soaring. They've gone up at least by 10 percentage points because now Ukrainians see that he's battling not only the Russians, but also the Trump administration on the diplomatic front. The more Trump applies various forms of pressure on Zelensky, the more Zelensky's countrymen and women rally around him. So I think if he were to hold elections now, and that's very much a hypothetical, not going to happen, he would win. To your point about the post-war Zelensky, what kind of leader he will be, I do remain concerned to an extent. There's going to be a lot of pressure on him and on the Ukrainian leadership to return very swiftly to politics as usual, democracy as usual, in terms of lifting all restrictions on the media, on the flight of capital, the movement of people out of the country. Those are going to be very difficult freedoms to return, and not only because of some kind of authoritarian tendencies in Zelensky, but really for very practical reasons.
For instance, if the government lifts martial law and men of fighting age can travel freely, huge numbers of them may leave the country, says Simon.
The estimate is that at least 1 or 2 million of them will leave to avoid a possible resumption of the war in which they could be drafted to serve. You lose those people as taxpayers, as contributors to the economy, and so on. That's devastating to Ukraine. It would be devastating. So there's going to be a lot of demands to lift those kinds of restrictions, but Zelensky is a tough guy, he's a stubborn guy, and I think he's going to avoid or resist giving back some of those freedoms.
According to Simon, one such freedom is freedom of the press.
There's going to be a lot of pressure on him to lift wartime propaganda. He is sensitive to criticism. He hates when he's constantly attacked on television. And he's quite comfortable with the current state of play where essentially criticism is muted. It's going to be a massive test for him as an individual, as a leader, for his commitments to democracy and freedom, the things for which Ukraine has been fighting these last years. And it's going to be a massive test for Ukrainians as well.
Simon is working on a new book on Ukraine's military industry and how it managed to produce all those drones so quickly. When we spoke in the spring, he told me that since the Oval Office blow-up in February, President Zelensky has been hesitant to grant interviews.
I think they're especially sensitive about Time magazine because they see it as something that Trump watches especially closely. When Angela Merkel in 2015 was Time Person of the Year, Trump began attacking her because he's the only one who deserves to be on the cover of Time.
A week after I spoke with Simon, Zelensky had reassessed his communication strategy and agreed to an interview. It turned into a Time magazine cover story. The cover image shows Zelensky leaning on his desk in the presidential office and staring stoically at the camera. Why did Zelensky agree to the meeting? In the article, Simon hypothesizes it was to clear the air after Zelensky's recent visit to the Oval Office. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Scoop, a Harriman Magazine podcast from Columbia University's Harriman Institute. I'm Masha Udensova-Brenner. This episode was written and produced by me and edited by Ann Cooper. If you like what you heard, please rate the podcast and leave us a review on your podcast platform. Until next time.